My name is Mark Baker, and I'm a historian, and I work on peasants. In particular, I've researched a lot about Ukrainian peasants, and other peasants as well. I have a bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Alberta, and a PhD from Harvard University in history. And I now teach at Koç University, which is in Istanbul, Turkey. My book is basically about the peasants who occupied the province that at the time was called Kharkivskaya Gubernia, part of the Russian Empire. And I used a wide variety of sources to try to figure out how they experienced this period of war, World War initially, and then revolution, national and social revolution, and then civil war, and then the beginnings of Soviet power. So it's about their experiences over that period of time. The project's main difficulty, as any social historian can tell you, is that most of my subjects didn't write anything down, and so we have to use the sources of others mostly to try to do this. With every now and then we get some kind of a first-person narrative, but very few. And so I used a lot of police reports because I was doing this kind of local history. I was doing a lot of that kind of thing where I had to look at police reports. I had to use newspapers, and then I had to use the early documents of the various Soviet governments, of the Central Rada, of the German occupation authorities, and the Ukrainian state. And just from all that, I managed to get together a kind of representative picture of peasants' experience in this province, which is now in eastern Ukraine. The idea for it came during my graduate studies when I studied the Ukrainian Revolution and realized there was very little research on peasants during the revolution, and I thought that was quite wrong because the overwhelming majority of speakers in that time period were, of course, peasants. And I thought it didn't make sense to not have very little. There's very little research by that time on peasants during the revolution. There's only really Stephen Gouchet's dissertation, which had never been published in any way. There was he got a couple of articles out of it, I think one in Slavic Review. So the idea was to get at the experience of peasants during this period and try to find out what to try to fill in this. I think it's a rather large, gap in the historiography that is now starting to be filled. But at the time there was nothing. So I went with trying to find something that was nobody ever researched really. To the extent that the historiography, the national historiography wrote about peasants, they tended to also not be from left bank. They tended to be the ones that were close to Kiev. Or, of course, there's a larger body of work on Eastern Galician peasants, by people like John Paul Himka and Andriy Zanyanyuk, and there's a lot more there actually. Probably partly because of archival access, et cetera. But so I wanted to expand our understanding to the left bank and talk more about, what peasants' experience was from that region. And Kharkiv was a natural choice because it was, largely unexplored. And it was also the case that the capital city, became the capital of the first Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. So it kind of made sense to find out what peasants were experiencing in and around the new capital. So most peasants didn't really think in national terms, nor did they think in class terms. I'm trying to sort of steer my way between two, rather unquestioned assumptions about peasants' behavior. One of them, the sort of idea that they had some natural class allegiance and so therefore followed the Soviet project. And the other one that they were supposedly, innate, natural, Ukrainians, and so they supported Ukraine, the Central Rada, most particularly. Their form of identity was mostly attached to their village, because they, like most people throughout most of human history, haven't thought in national terms. That's the way I see it. I'm not one of those who thinks that nationalism has been a widespread phenomenon for a long time. I think it's a fairly recent phenomenon. And for me, the key thing about nationalism is, of course, that people think they identify with people who they'll never meet, people far, far away, and even go to war and fight for those people, thinking that they identify as a group. But these peasants, as far as I could tell from my sources, were most identified with their village. To some extent, they might also have a sort of regional identity that'll go sort of just up to maybe sort of the county level. But beyond that, they tended to think most others were outsiders. And I found this in all sorts of documents that I read. There's lots of different ways I got at it. One of them was I found, I looked at the Kharkiv Provincial Soviet of Peasants' Deputies, which existed from 1917. And there, unusually, there's actually a fairly long run. Actually, I think it's the complete run of their protocols from the executive committee of the Kharkiv Provincial Soviet of Peasants' Deputies. And that run allowed me to sort of look at what issues did these, Soviet officials think they were, how are they dealing with peasants? And so one of the things I found in reading over these protocols was that one of their main concerns was money. And they didn't have enough money, and which is not surprising, right? They didn't have enough money. And so what this Soviet did, I think a lot of other Soviets did the same thing. They tried to impose a so-called self-tax. And the idea there is that, okay, we are the Kharkiv Provincial Soviet of Peasants' Deputies, so we should get the peasants to fund us. So they tried to get the peasants to pay a small tax to fund them. And it wasn't, this is one of the things I found in my research, is that actually it wasn't very much money by the standards of the time. They couldn't get the peasants to give it up. So my conclusion from that was that the peasants didn't identify with even this provincial level Soviet enough to give up this tax to the provincial level. A funny thing about it is that they were willing to give up money to their village Soviet, right? Like, you were talking about how did they receive the first ideas about the Soviet, et cetera. So one of the things they did is they would often turn their village skid or schod, or whatever they called it, their village assembly, their assembly of elders. They would often just rename it a Soviet or a Rada. It depended, of course, on what was the primary language, or it didn't even always depend on that, because sometimes there is the word Soviet in Ukrainian, so they sometimes use that word too. But anyways, they called it something that sounded like the rumors they heard from afar, and so that's one of the things that they would do to change. But they otherwise, and like I said, at the village level, they were willing to give up some money to fund that local Soviet. They were, like I said, there's lots of evidence like this, that they were profoundly localist. They sort of just thought, this was important, and what was going on really far away wasn't that important, really. And I found this also during the big land grab. One of the things I talk about in the book is there's this thing, it's sometimes called the Agrarian Revolution. But what it really was peasants deciding that the rest of the land that was not full or under their ownership by 1917, that they should take that into their control and be able to farm it. And so they did that, and they did it in a very effective way. It's quite interesting how they did it. So there was some physical violence between villagers from different villages over the land. I found a couple of cases of them shooting at each other, and there was a case where a couple of peasants from one village were killed, and unfortunately the document trail was great, but it was pretty clear they were fighting over this land that both wanted to seize. You see, that's the thing. And so that showed me that it wasn't just that they weren't interested in the Soviet or what the Central Rada was doing in Kiev, but they were also willing to fight against a village right near them over the land, and sometimes forest, that they had taken from somebody else. There was this one really interesting case where they'd taken it from the Imperial Army. The Imperial Army had some land holdings for various reasons, and there was some of that land in Kharkiv province. And so villages near it, they all tried to take it, and they ended up getting into a big argument who should get it, because there was too many villages and not enough land. It's the usual thing. And so that again showed me this sort of sense of local identity, that they don't really feel some kind of unity even with villages just a few kilometers away. Yeah. So the last chapter is also one of the things I really like about it is it combines both the problem of this localness but also with a sort of willingness to compromise. So even though they'd gone through the Civil War, and during the Civil War there had been some pretty nasty and violent things that happened to a lot of peasants, and the 1919 Soviet government was particularly bad. The people running that government were, what have we put it, they were communists with great conviction. And so they tried to ram a bunch of things down the peasants' throats that they didn't want, especially they introduced what they called komuni at the time. That's what they called them, not collective farms, but similar kind of idea. And the peasants just hated that. And so the reason that the 1919 government left was not just because they were unpopular, but because the whites came in, the Denikin's volunteer army, and kicked them out. So when they came back in 1920, one of the things that surprised me is the peasants still expressed some willingness to compromise. They still thought it was better, I guess, than Denikin. And so I found this amazing set of documents, talking about trying to get at peasants' voices. There was a series of conferences that the government held across the province in early 1920 to try to find out just what the peasants were up to and to try to convince them about some of their policies. And these were called non-party or bezpartini party conferences. And they held them at the local level, and they held them up to the provincial level. And I was able to find the original stenograms of the local ones, really what we might call maybe the county level. And those were absolutely fascinating to read because they hadn't been edited or, they hadn't sort of been clean of the sort of, the material that was interesting to listen to. And so one of the things that was fascinating about that was that, and they had a horrible time convincing the peasants that they spoke for them. It was absolutely fascinating. And it got to the point where at each of these, so you can imagine a kind of district level, so it's somewhere between the province and the county level, something in between that. At those district level meetings, conferences, they couldn't convince the peasants who were there, representatives there, that the communists represented them or any of the other parties represented them. And they wanted instead on the committee that ran the sort of executive committee that ran the Congress, they wanted to have a representative from each county. You see, this gets to my localism thing again. They wanted to. It was like literally like they wanted to have. So like let's say that the district had 25 counties. They wanted 25 people on the executive committee because they didn't trust even the next committee, even the next county. You see what I mean? It's like this sort of thing. So it's got both of those things in it. It's got this re-expression of localism, but also a willingness to try to cooperate with the Soviet government. And one of the other really fascinating things about it is that the Communist Party leaders who were at these meetings, they didn't really seem to get that. They really seemed to not understand that the peasants wanted a compromise. And so they tried to convince them again of things that, in this case, I think it was food requisitions. They wanted to convince them that the peasants had to give up more grain. And the peasants just didn't buy into it. They didn't believe it. And they got into big arguments about it. And then later in the spring of 1920, there actually were a few uprisings that were provoked by this effort to try to requisition food from these villages. The biggest one was in a district called Valky, which is a really interesting area. And Valky had a lot more Ukrainian Socialist Party sort of operatives in the area. And so the Valky uprising in April of 1920 took on it had a national tinge to it, which was unusual in my research. I didn't find many of those, but it was certainly there. And it was expressed in the documents. So what I sort of got from that is that, like I said, the general sense is that the peasants behaved very locally, but that they were starting to figure out that the Ukrainian idea might be some kind of an alternative. So when I went to go do research there, I wasn't like the first, I was nowhere near the first Canadian to go and try and do research in the archive, but I was one of the first, graduate students to go in there, with a big project like this, and in Kharkiv in particular, I think I might have been the first Canadian graduate student doing research there. They treated me very well. It was a great time. But one of the things that I was going to have this great memory of was I was the first person as far as I can tell, to want to use a laptop computer in the central, what's it called, the Central State Archive of Higher Organs of Power, just in Kiev. And I tried to bring my computer to the reading room, and the person who ran the place at the time, she was very, very much against it. You might think of her as kind of a Luddite technophobe or something, but she was very worried about what I was going to do. I think she thought somehow I could, I don't know, vaporize or do something to the documents with my laptop. It was just a very primitive old Mac PowerBook. But they didn't want me to come in with the computer, and I eventually what I had to do is I had to ask an old friend, Yuri Shapoval, to make some phone calls to help me get into the reading room with my laptop. So that was kind of interesting in itself. But as far as the organization of the archives, they weren't very well organized. And I think one of the things you have to sort of realize if you do research in I think it's any of the former Soviet republics, is that they didn't organize a lot of the material. I think a lot of the material is missing, to be quite honest. It could be that some of it is like in some other building and just it was never filed properly, or it was never even looked through. But you do really get the sense that the material that you get in those archives is selected, right? Like they selected it for some specific purpose rather than, because the idea a historian has in mind is I would like to see as much as possible the comprehensive body of material so I can sort of choose. Obviously I can't read it all, but I can choose much better if I can get a whole run of a set of documents. But what happened during the Soviet period is they very selectively chose stuff. It was usually to try to promote a certain kind of founder's myth about, the great October Revolution kind of idea. And so I had to deal with that constantly. I had to struggle with that, and I had to try to figure out how to read the opusy. There's an opusy are like these lists of the files that are in any particular fond. Sort of go through those and try and figure out from reading the headings whether it might be useful. And so I was probably known as one of those people who ordered a ton of sprava, it's the files, to try to find one that had something that was useful. And so I didn't really, in a way, I kind of didn't believe the organization of the archive, and I often had to sort of just I ordered all sorts of stuff just to see if maybe in there was something that I didn't, that wasn't listed in, the lists, these opus are just not very clear, and so it's hard to tell what's in there. So I spent a lot of time reading stuff that but every now and then I found these gems. Like I said, I found these non-party peasant conference, the stenograms of those, the original stenograms, those were, and sometimes the police reports from the Tsarist period were unusually frank. There's a part in the first chapter about World War I, all about the soldatki. The soldatki, what they were the wives of soldiers who'd been, mobilized into the army and were fighting at the front. And they became a really strong social group. They seemed to have a kind of a collective identity during the First World War, and they got involved in two main things. They mobilized themselves to stop the Stolypin land reform. I don't know how much your readers know about Russian and Ukrainian history, but from about 1906 to the war, there was this thing called the Stolypin land reform, which was an attempt to kind of consolidate and privatize land holdings of peasants and break up the commune. But the government, the Tsarist government, tried to continue that during the war, and the soldatki hated it because their husbands were away and they figured they wouldn't get a good deal. And so they were so resistant that it led to these large-scale riots. There was one particular one in, Nizhna Sirovatka, that was so big that they required not the governor, but the governor's, the vice governor actually had to take a train and go out there, and he brought a small contingent of police with him to put down the uprising. It was quite a fascinating little thing. But it was led by these soldatki. And so I was very lucky there because the police had written a lot of very detailed reports on those uprisings and riots, and so I was able to use those. And sometimes they actually quoted them in those. They would quote the peasants, and so that was really surprising to get that kind of thing. But it was It was hard, let me tell you. Most of that stuff from the Tsar's period, I had to read on microfilm. And let me tell you, that was not fun. Reading the microfilm they had these very old machines to try to read it, and it projects onto the screen, and it was, oh my God, that was a nightmare. But anyway, so there's lots of challenges like that. I also, since then, I've done a lot of research in Kazan. It's the capital of Tatarstan. And in Kazan, I found all sorts of crazy stuff going on in that archive. The woman, I got to know the woman who ran the reading room really well, and she told me that she thought sometimes the people who were doing the collating or putting them together were actually maybe kind of drunk and were just sort of playing jokes by putting certain documents in there that were not relevant at all. I don't know if that's true, but she did tell me that there's a whole bunch of material in that archive upstairs somewhere that's just never even been filed. Like nobody even knows what's in it. So the challenges are tremendous, but I hope maybe there's a lot of Ukrainian historians are working in Ukrainian archives, and they're probably helping to organize the archives better than they used to be, because that was a real challenge for me. But then, so like I said, most of the material is based on what others wrote about what peasants said or did. And so you had to be very practiced at reading them. Doing this thing historians do a lot, which is they look for unwitting testimony, where basically the author of the document might be trying to tell me something, but I'm looking to see what maybe they're not telling me, you see. So that's one of the most fascinating things about being a historian, actually. The general thing I sort of already suggested, and that is that I think I had a very naive sense of being able to find out what peasants were thinking. That was really the hardest part, was to try to figure that question out. And I didn't realize how hard that would be. Like my dissertation proposal was about all these different possible identities that I thought I would be able to find in the archive, and that was really hard to find those. And I ended up throwing a lot of that out and just saying, okay, well, there's a couple of key themes I can see here. Clearly peasants are showing their preference for the local. So I just sort of ended up, it's true that often you go into these big projects with all sorts of expectations, and then the archives hit you and you go, oh, I guess I have to do something else. It's quite a common thing. One of the things I would like readers to get from it is that the lives of these peasants were important, and that when the historiography focuses so much on political and military leaders, we miss a crucial part of the story. And we really can't understand history, Ukrainian or Russian or any other kind of history. We really can't understand it unless we're willing to put the time in to do serious research into how these people lived. Historians have for a long time had a tendency to focus on elites. I'm not just talking about Ukrainian historiography or Ukrainian national historiography. Soviet historiography was maybe worse, because they really focused on the party leadership. So I would like people who read the book to come away from it thinking, okay, so now I have a good understanding of how, you might say, an average Ukrainian experienced this period, right? Because I would think peasants were actually the more representative people in the country. It's spending all this time in the archive to try to figure out something important about what really happened. That's, to me, the essence of what a historian does, actually. I think it's a part I love, anyways. I love being in an archive and just reading documents and trying to figure out what this person was thinking way back then. It's like now 100 years ago. I remember when I was a kid, I read Encyclopedia Brown books. Do you remember those books? They're very silly, but they're kind of like you try to figure out a sort of puzzle that he would always figure out. And I think that plays a role, that I kind of like the idea that I'm taking this thing that I found that was created, like I said, like 100 years ago, and I'm trying to figure out what we can learn about what was really going on at the time, or what the person who wrote it was thinking, or what the people she or he was writing about were thinking. That's just fascinating to me. I just think that's the essence of doing history. Because most of the documents from the Tsar's period, all the documents are pretty much written in Russian, but there is mention sometimes that police would quote one of the peasants in something that was Ukrainian for sure. I think the majority of them spoke Ukrainian, but maybe you know that the peasants who lived in that part of Ukraine, they developed a kind of mixed language. It's not really like Surge Ukrainian. It's kind of it's got some elements of Russian and some elements of Ukrainian in it. So there was that kind of thing amongst them. So that's maybe as far as the language goes. As far as their economic situation, in the first chapter I talk quite a bit about this because one of the big debates about World War I is whether or not the peasants were impoverished by World War I. And what I found basically was that most of them, historians often talk about this thing about relative deprivation, and I think there was a lot of that going on amongst the peasants, but they weren't starving at that time. They were starving later at the end of the Civil War. Maybe you know that there was a famine that touched parts of Kharkiv province too, and that was they were starving then. But before the revolution, I conclude in that chapter that they probably, the overall majority of them weren't really hungry, but there was a portion of them that were doing much worse than they had been before the war. And this was partly because a lot of the men, about 50% of the able-bodied adult men had been mobilized into the army. But not only because of that, they also faced a lot of hardships because of inflation. The governments, local governments, and sometimes the Tsarist government, they tried to control the prices because there was massive inflation during the war. And the peasants, of course, in that deal, often were on the side of trying to sell their goods, and they were, constricted by the control on basic food prices. And so there was definitely some economic impoverishment during World War I. And then, of course, as the revolution and civil war went on, and there's much more dislocation and chaos, their economic situation got worse. For most of them, it actually was pretty bad by the end of the period that I'm writing about. No, they weren't all poor. Of course, there was differentiation amongst them, and there was ones who were much better off than others. But, I mean, the majority of them were what we might call middling peasants. But they're not, by any means, rich by modern standards or anything like that, right? I mean, even most sort of, working class people living in a city nowadays wouldn't tolerate the kinds of things that those people live with. There is a lot more research being done by Ukrainian historians in Ukraine. I'm in contact with quite a few of them, and they have a journal now. It's published called Selyan, Peasant. And it's been coming out for a few years now, and I know some of the people who are working with it. It's quite a fascinating thing. But relatively speaking, I would say it's Ukrainian historians studying peasants is much lower than those studying, let's say, the Central Rada or any of the more controversial issues in Ukrainian history like World War II. So I would say that yes, we definitely need more people doing research on it. When I was a grad student, there were actually two other grad students. The other two were from the UK. One was Canadian and one was Scottish. And they were also doing research on peasants, which was really an unusual moment. This is like 1990, what is that now? 1995, 96, 97, that period. And there were the three of us in the archive doing this research, and I was the only one who ended up publishing a book out of it, because neither of them ended up actually doing academic careers. But at least I'm still in touch with one of them, Graham Tan, who wrote his thesis at CEAS at University of London, and a very good thesis about right bank peasants during the same period. There was a strong tendency in the Ukrainian national historiography, both the diaspora and then in the the historiography that emerged since 1991, that there's a strong assumption in that literature that the majority of the population of the territories that became Ukraine, the majority supported the Rada and the various, and also the directory, the governments there. I would say that that's just not true. That seems, from my research, that seems clear, and like I was saying, there's a few other people who've done work on this. Their research has also said a similar thing. that, for the most part, they were pretty localist in their identity, and they didn't think much about these bigger issues. A lot of times they didn't know much about them, right? And they were just sort of figuring it out at the time. So I think it's wrong for people to assume that they had this identity that they didn't have, or that it was not very important to them. So, yeah, I guess that would be the main way it's changing. I mean, there's some interesting stuff in there about their interaction with Soviet governments as well, and about how this sort of thing I already talked about, how about they're willing to compromise, but then the party leaders didn't seem to see that willingness to compromise and tended to be quite brutal at times, heavy-handed with peasants. And so that, too, I think was deeply problematic. And then I guess one other thing I just thought of was the German occupation. I have the whole chapter about the German occupation, and one of the things I stress in that is that it was a pretty brutal occupation. I mean, it wasn't like World War II, obviously, not at all. But the German soldiers occupied almost entirely by German soldiers, and they behaved very badly, sort of arbitrarily seizing things, taking what wasn't theirs, not giving peasants any compensation. And peasants really resented that. That was a big problem at the local level.